with a few comments. First, it's wonderful to be here with a fellow South African, Sir David King. He did go to a different university, somewhere up in the north compared to those who know Cape Town. And in preparing for this session, I went to revisit Kirstenbosch, which people from Wits may know is the most spectacular botanical garden on the planet. And I must say, I continue to get this feeling of overwhelming exhilaration and dread when you walk around. Dread because the extinction section of the garden is growing, and the plants close to extinction are now clearly visible out there. Some of the plants in the garden are the only one left anywhere on the planet. And I think if one really wants to bring home the reality of what extinction means, there's nothing like seeing the very last plant on the planet that will soon be gone. And I like to take my little son of 8 to go and look and see, well, how is it going to be that he will have a chance to see a flourishing garden, not just there but elsewhere. That sense of pending gloom was made worse by reading William Powers's recent piece in World Policy Journal. William Powers went off to go and live in a 12 by 12 cabin off-grid in North Carolina and write about his experiences, which are certainly worth reading. The key points he made was his great concern about the pending ecocide we're seeing, and a deep questioning of what is enough, and who defines what is enough in terms of total consumption, all types of consumption. Certainly worth reading. But that sense of anxiety, I think, shouldn't be the focus of our work. And we are obviously in a very privileged setting here in the T.S. Eliot Lecture Theatre. And one of his well-known quotes was that anxiety is the handmaiden of creativity. And I hope that by being here, we're going to turn from that sense of anxiety to one of creativity and implementation, as Laurent suggested we need to do. One last comment before moving to the speakers. One could ask, what is somebody from a corporation, particularly one that makes soft drinks and sugary drinks, and got to do with the debate here? Well, it was very interesting that in the last couple of years, our CEO, Indra Nooyi, has asked our legal counsel to ask a question of what is the responsibility of a company from a legal point of view, not an ethical and a moral point of view, in terms of the environment and human health. And the answer was very interesting. He had to go through case law over the last decades, century, to really make the case that since companies are granted their license in perpetuity, they need to act accordingly, which means that becoming stewards of the environment and protecting human health and well-being shouldn't be seen as a moral and nice issue. Increasingly, it's being seen as a legal requirement. And that very clear legal message is one that is complementing, obviously, the more emotional, moral, and ethical aspects, and driving us, and many companies around the world, to be looking 20, 30, 40, 50 years out at a supply chain that is increasingly vulnerable. Vulnerable in terms of all of the major commodities that we'll be using, whether they are agricultural or whether they are going to be needed for energy. And hopefully during this session and the sessions to come, we'll be able to see how that sense of urgency, certainly that I see inside corporations, can link to the sense of discourse and discussion that we're seeing in government, so that we can have a greater sense of implementation moving ahead. Well, we have an extraordinary group of people, and probably it's going to be easiest, if you really want to go into their backgrounds, to read in the book the very well described bios. So I'm not going to introduce them. And I think Laurent gave us a very good sense of the opening sessions. And we'll be starting looking at international and national policies and commitments, which set the framework for action, tend to be often the lowest common denominator. Having been involved in some international treaty processes at WHO, I know that they very rarely tend to be the highest level of aspiration. So I'm hoping that they will address what actually had to be compromised to get to what are our current norms and standards. And then we'll move on to the economy toolbox issues. So to kick off, we have Simon Upton from the OECD, and I would suggest that people speak from here. We don't sit there because you won't be able to see things, and then we'll take the discussions. Just to remind you, Laura is sitting here, another fellow South African, so we have a conspiracy in the front row. We'll operate the trap door from here when you get to the end of your time. Simon.